The most dangerous part of this dispute is not the uranium number. It is the word unacceptable. That is the real battlefield. Honestly, whoever gets to define what is unacceptable first gets to define the crisis. And once that happens, every later move is made on their terrain, under their language, and inside their political frame. Let me be very clear about something. Trump and Iran are not only fighting over enrichment levels, inspection terms, or the exact percentage of fissile material. They are fighting over the right to name the line that cannot be crossed. That matters because unacceptable is not a technical term. It is a political weapon, basically. It creates the moral precondition for sanctions, for military threats, for diplomatic ultimatums. And if the machinery reaches that point, for strikes that can be sold as necessary rather than chosen. This is why the first declaration is so powerful. Once one side says, in effect, this is unacceptable, the burden shifts. The other side is no longer simply defending its policy. It is defending its legitimacy. It has to explain why the line was drawn there, why the line was not crossed, and why its own actions should not trigger the consequences already being prepared in public. That is not a debate over fact. That is a contest over framing. Trump understands this instinctively. He does not need to prove that Iran has crossed some laboratory threshold in order to generate pressure. He needs to establish a political story in which Iranian behavior is already dangerous enough to justify escalation. That story does not have to be airtight. It has to be durable. Actually, it has to survive cable news, survive congressional hesitation, survive allied discomfort, and survive the gap between what is technically measurable and what is politically actionable. If he can make unacceptable the dominant word, he controls the sequence. Tehran understands the same thing. It does not need to win the argument on a single enrichment statistic to gain leverage. It needs to make the American side look impulsive, coercive, and predictable. It needs to force Washington into a posture where every threat sounds like overreach and every demand sounds like an effort to move the line after the fact. If Iran can make the American definition of unacceptable look arbitrary, then sanctions begin to look like theater, threats begin to look like bluff, and talks begin to look like the only adult option. This is why the definition itself becomes more important than the number. A number can be negotiated, inspected, delayed, or revised. A definition is a claim of authority. It says, who gets to decide when diplomacy has failed? It says, who gets to tell the public that the moment has arrived for pain? It says, who gets to turn a technical dispute into a national emergency? The domestic incentives are obvious once you strip away the noise. Trump benefits from a frame in which firmness is seen as strength and restraint is seen as weakness. He does not need a war to gain advantage from the threat of one. He needs a credible confrontation that makes his adversaries look out of position and his supporters look vindicated. Tehran, by contrast, benefits from a frame in which resistance is seen as sovereignty and compromise is seen as humiliation. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is the internal logic of a system that treats backing down as a strategic defeat. So the hidden bargaining is not just about policy detail. It is about which leadership can absorb domestic cost while forcing the other side to explain itself. The side that defines the red line first does not merely shape the debate. It creates the script for the next phase. Sanctions become necessary. Military deployments become defensive. Negotiations become last chances. Every tool is reinterpreted through the frame already chosen, and that frame has consequences beyond the immediate standoff. If Washington defines the crisis as a response to Iranian defiance, it creates permission for escalation without looking like escalation. If Tehran defines the crisis as proof of American coercion, it creates permission for defiance without looking like recklessness. In both cases, the language of necessity begins to crowd out the language of choice. That is when diplomacy gets brittle. That is when each move starts to look like the only move. The regional players understand this perfectly. Gulf states, Israel, European governments, and energy markets are not only watching the substance. They are watching who is winning the authority to narrate events. Because once the narrative hardens, the options narrow, a sanctions package becomes harder to unwind, a military deployment becomes harder to reverse, a retaliatory move becomes easier to justify. The political frame becomes its own infrastructure. Most people think the first danger is enrichment. It is not. The first danger is definitional capture. If one side succeeds in making its preferred red line sound like common sense, then the entire escalation ladder is already in place before the public notices it. That is how pressure is manufactured. That is how legitimacy is assigned. That is how conflict begins to look less like a choice and more like a response. That is where the story moves from abstract framing to domestic necessity. Both Trump and Tehran have internal audiences that make flexibility look dangerous. That is where the story moves from abstract framing to domestic necessity. Both Trump and Tehran have internal audiences that make flexibility look dangerous. And once you understand that, the public statements stop looking like diplomacy and start looking like discipline. In Washington, toughness is not just a posture. It is a signal to a political base that measures strength in visible refusal, in the absence of concession, in the constant proof that the president is not being managed by the same class of people who spent years promising restraint and delivering drift. Trump's audience does not reward subtlety. It rewards the appearance of control, the appearance of consistency, the appearance of someone who will not be maneuvered by experts, allies, or bureaucrats. That means every statement has to do more than communicate policy. It has to reassure supporters that pressure is being applied, that America is not being taken for a ride, and that the White House is not shrinking from confrontation. In Tehran, the logic is equally rigid and just as political. Resistance is not merely a foreign policy choice. It is tied to regime legitimacy. It is tied to the narrative that the Islamic Republic survives because it does not bend when pressure arrives. It is tied to deterrence credibility, because if the leadership looks weak under threat, then every rival in the region reads that weakness as an invitation. And most of all, it is tied to an old fear inside the system, that any concession, once made, becomes the opening move in a longer sequence of demands. The leadership knows this. The security establishment knows this. The public rhetoric is built around that fear because the political consequences of being seen as too eager to compromise can be far more dangerous than the costs of delay. So both sides are trapped by their own narratives. Trump cannot easily sound patient without sounding weak. Iranian leaders cannot easily sound flexible without sounding compromised. That is why the language hardens long before the substance does. It is not accidental. It is the domestic political armor that makes each side feel safe enough to continue. What happens next is hidden bargaining over definitions, not yet over surrender or peace, but over what counts as leverage, what counts as restraint, and what counts as a concession. One side wants to define pressure as proof that the other will eventually yield. The other side wants to define pressure as proof that resistance is still necessary. Those definitions matter because they shape whether a move is interpreted as a signal or as an insult. A missile test, a sanctions announcement, a naval interception, a nuclear statement, a speech to supporters, a warning to allies, all of it becomes part of the same contest. Who controls the frame that tells the public what this moment means? That is why military and economic tools are used so deliberately. The point is not always immediate battlefield effect. The point is to manufacture pressure that can be explained at home. Sanctions become evidence that the other side is failing. Military deployments become evidence that the leadership is acting. Controlled escalation becomes a domestic political instrument because it allows each government to say, we are not yielding, we are managing, we are protecting national dignity. The risk is that once pressure becomes political theater, the theater begins to drive the strategy. Leaders then keep escalating because backing down would be harder to explain than continuing. This is the part most observers miss. The real contest is not only between Washington and Tehran. It is inside each capital between the logic of statecraft and the logic of political survival. The strategic question is whether either leadership can separate short-term domestic signaling from long-term national interest. Sometimes compromise would be useful. Sometimes it would reduce risk, but if the internal narrative makes compromise look like defeat, then even a rational deal becomes politically poisonous. So the rhetoric is not just for show. It prepares the ground for a pressure campaign that uses time, money, and fear as weapons. And once that campaign is underway, every statement becomes a test of resolve, every pause becomes a message, and every move is judged not by whether it improves stability, but by whether it preserves the story each side needs to tell its own people. So the rhetoric is not just for show. It prepares the ground for a pressure campaign that uses time, money, and fear as weapons. And once you see that, the whole sequence stops looking spontaneous and starts looking engineered. Sanctions are never just sanctions. They are a signal to banks, insurers, shipping firms, commodity traders, and domestic voters that the target is being boxed into a narrower and narrower corridor of choice. The purpose is not only to reduce revenue or restrict movement, it is to alter expectations before the first collision to convince everyone watching that the target is already paying a price for defiance. Deadline setting works the same way. A deadline is not merely a date on a calendar, it is a device that compresses political time, forces public attention onto a single point, and creates the impression that delay equals weakness. Naval signaling follows the same logic. A destroyer in a corridor, a carrier group moving on a predictable route, a flight deck visible on every screen. These are not only military facts, they are messages sent to markets and ministries. The message is simple. Escalation is available. Proximity is real. And the cost of miscalculation is but pressure only matters if the other side believes the threat is credible. And credibility depends on one thing above all, whether the red line can actually be enforced. Let me be very clear about something. A red line is not a fact on the map. It is a performance. And if the performance is weak once, the audience starts testing it twice. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand something that the public debate usually misses. The real contest is not over the wording of the warning. It is over the belief that crossing it will produce a cost that cannot be absorbed. That belief is built from memory. It is built from the last crisis, the last concession, the last moment when a government said it would act and then did something smaller, slower, or more ambiguous than its language suggested. That is how deterrence erodes. Not all at once, not in a dramatic collapse. It erodes through inconsistency. One administration draws a hard line. The next softens it. One official says the issue is vital. Another says it is negotiable. A military posture is announced, then delayed. A deployment is threatened, then folded into consultation. The result is simple. The other side stops asking what the stated policy is and starts asking what the political system can tolerate. And that question is the one that matters, because both sides watch hesitation with clinical attention. They are not listening for slogans. They are measuring thresholds. They are asking what triggers a real response, what triggers symbolic outrage, and what gets absorbed into the normal noise of crisis management. If one side learns that a certain action produces condemnation, but no real cost, that action becomes available. If the other side learns that a particular line really will be enforced, that line acquires weight. Credibility is not declared. It is accumulated through repeated behavior. This is why visible preparation matters, not for its own sake, but because it changes the interpretation of intent. When assets move forward, when allies coordinate in public, when logistical systems are put under strain on purpose, the message is not simply that force exists. The message is that the political system has already accepted the possibility of using it. That is very different from rhetorical firmness. Rhetoric is cheap, preparation is expensive, and expensive signals are harder to dismiss. The mechanics are brutal. A government with no military options is not making a red line, it is making a wish. A government with options but no willingness to show them is not much better. What gives a threat meaning is the combination of limited but real capability, allied coherence, and a domestic political structure that can survive the decision to act. If any one of those elements is missing, the line begins to blur. That is why domestic politics matter so much. Leaders do not speak only to adversaries. They speak to coalition partners, parliaments, donors, voters' factions inside their own bureaucracy. Every public warning is also an act of internal positioning. It tells allies how far they are expected to go. It tells bureaucrats what planning assumptions to adopt. It tells the opposition what issue can be used as a wedge. So when a red line is announced, the real question is whether the state has built the institutional discipline to stand behind it when the costs appear. Most of the time, that discipline is weaker than the language. That gap is where the other side operates. They study the hesitation because hesitation reveals the true boundary between the unacceptable and the merely theatrical. They study the pauses, the exceptions, the carefully chosen ambiguity. They look at what was tolerated after the last violation. They look at whether the threatened response arrived quickly or after the fact or not at all. They look at whether economic pressure was coordinated or fragmented, whether military signaling was sustained or cosmetic, whether allies were aligned or visibly divided. Every inconsistency becomes data, and once that data is absorbed, the strategic environment changes. The red line no longer functions as a barrier. It becomes a negotiation. The other side begins searching for loopholes, partial compliance, deniable actions, proxy mechanisms, and controlled ambiguity. That is not accidental. It is the natural result of a line whose enforcement has been questioned before. If a boundary can be approached without consequence, it will be approached. If it can be crossed through intermediaries, it will be tested through intermediaries. If direct confrontation is too dangerous, the struggle moves into the shadows. That is why the deeper question is never simply whether conflict happens. Conflict is always available. The question is who controls the frame that makes conflict seem necessary, avoidable, or inevitable. Whoever controls that frame controls the political tempo, and whoever controls the tempo controls the space in which everyone else has to react. That is why the next phase is always a search for loopholes, proxies, and controlled ambiguity. When direct confrontation is too dangerous, the struggle moves into the shadows. Once credibility is tested, both sides begin to probe for escape routes, because no one wants to be the first to pay the full cost of crossing from threat into war. That is where the real bargaining begins, not in public speeches, but in the shadow zone where ambiguity is treated as a weapon. Proxies matter because they let a state apply pressure without owning every consequence. A militia fires a rocket. A fast boat harasses a tanker. A cyber unit disrupts a port, and the sponsoring power can deny direct control while still benefiting from the effect. That is not noise. That is the mechanism. It creates a layered signal, resolve to the target, restraint to the world, and flexibility for the sponsor, if the response comes back harder than expected. The whole point is to keep the action below the threshold that would force an immediate, unmistakable reply. Maritime incidents work the same way. A collision, a boarding, a seizure, a drone near a shipping lane, a suspicious explosion on a hull. Each event can be framed as accident, criminality, local initiative, or simple confusion. In practice, that ambiguity is the message. It tells the other side that the route is vulnerable, that commerce can be interrupted, and that escalation can be dialed up one notch at a time. The sea is especially useful for this kind of pressure because attribution is slow, evidence is incomplete, and the tactical picture is often murky for hours or days. By then, the political effect has already landed. Cyber pressure extends the same logic into systems that do not bleed on camera. A network intrusion against logistics, finance, energy, or communications can impose cost while staying below the level that would justify kinetic retaliation. The attack may be denied, masked, or routed through criminal infrastructure, but the strategic intent is clear enough to the people who matter. It is a way of saying, we can reach inside your machine, and you will have to decide whether to treat that as war or as background friction. That decision is the battlefield. Deniable attacks do something even more important. They force the target to choose between restraint and escalation under uncertainty. If the response is too strong, the target looks reckless. If it is too weak, the target looks vulnerable. That is why ambiguity is not a side effect. It is a core instrument. It lets leaders signal without fully committing, test red lines without immediately crossing them, and preserve room to step back if the reaction proves more dangerous than expected. Domestic politics sharpens the incentive on both sides. Leaders do not operate in a vacuum. They operate inside audiences, factions, and institutional rivals who punish weakness faster than they in the shadow zone. Every move is meant to stay below the threshold of open war, yet the accumulation of small moves can still force a much larger decision. That is the part most people miss. The ceiling is not fixed by one capital, one cabinet, or one military command. It is negotiated in real time by Israel, by the Gulf monarchies, by Europe, by Russia, by China, and by the oil market itself. Let me be very clear about something. Unacceptable is not a universal category. It is a political product. What one state calls a tolerable strike, another treats as a red line because the impact lands on shipping insurance, refinery margins, domestic fuel prices, alliance credibility, or election year vulnerability. A missile launch in the wrong place does not just hit a target. It can move Brent crude by $5, $10, or $15 a barrel. It can force tankers to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope. It can raise freight rates, tighten insurance clauses, and make every cabinet in Europe ask a different question than the one asked in Jerusalem, Tehran, or Washington. That is why the regional picture matters. Israel does not operate in a vacuum. Its freedom of action is shaped by American backing, but also by Gulf sensitivity to market shocks, by Arab back-channel diplomacy, and by the fear in every capital that a limited exchange becomes a wider systems failure. The Gulf states are not passive spectators. They are price setters in a physical sense and pressure setters in a political sense. If the Strait of Hormuz feels unstable, they lose revenue certainty. Investors discount their future, and every public promise of strategic calm becomes more expensive to maintain. Europe is even more exposed than it likes to admit. It lives with thin energy buffers, fragile industrial margins, and political coalitions that can be broken by a winter of expensive gas and higher transport costs. That means European governments do not just react to escalation for moral reasons. They react because escalation changes the cost of keeping their own societies together. A closure threat in the Red Sea, a disruption in the Eastern Mediterranean, or a sustained rise in oil benchmarks ripples through fertilizer, aviation, trucking, and household heating. The result is that European diplomacy quietly becomes part of the ceiling, not because Europe commands the battlefield, but because it can raise the political cost of keeping that battlefield open. Russia understands this perfectly. Moscow watches every energy shock as an opportunity to widen the strategic burden on Western capitals. If prices rise, pressure on sanctions discipline rises too. If shipping lanes become precarious, Russian leverage over alternative supply routes improves. China reads the same chart with different priorities. Beijing wants stability, but it wants leverage more.